Imagine standing in a field. The ground beneath your feet is soft, not from rain, but from blood that soaked in hours ago. The man beside you is shaking, not from cold. He's been shaking since dawn, and he can't stop. Somewhere ahead, through the smoke and the noise that sounds less like thunder and more like screaming, thousands of men are trying to kill you. You've never met them. You probably never will. You'll be dead before you do. This is medieval warfare. Not the kind with noble knights charging gloriously across painted canvases. Not the kind that Hollywood built out of slow-motion heroics and clean sword strikes. The real thing. The kind that historians quietly piece together from coroners' records, mass graves, and the accounts of people who survived long enough to write down what they saw, and spent the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't. What you were taught in school, if you were taught anything at all, was a cleaned-up, simplified version designed to fit inside a chapter. What actually happened on those battlefields across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East for roughly 1,000 years is something far stranger, far more brutal, and in some ways, far more human than any textbook dares to explain. Let's go back. The first thing that shatters the fantasy is the smell. Before a single weapon is drawn, before a shield wall forms or a cavalry charge begins, medieval armies reeked. Men who had marched for weeks without bathing, who slept in the same wool they fought in, who had no sanitation beyond whatever ditch was nearest. These men carried with them a physical presence that was almost weaponized by proximity. Chronicles from the period describe enemy forces by their odor before their appearance. This wasn't just discomfort, it was demoralizing. The smell of an opposing army, particularly a large one, was a psychological assault before the physical one began. And that psychological dimension of medieval combat is almost entirely absent from popular understanding. Fear in battle is not a footnote. It is the central fact of the experience. Modern neuroscience tells us what medieval soldiers lived firsthand. Under extreme stress, the human body floods with adrenaline, the digestive system shuts down, fine motor control collapses, and the mind either fixates or fragments. Men lost control of their bowels before engagements. Not as a joke, not as an insult, as a physiological reality documented across centuries of warfare. The men who stood their ground despite all of that weren't brave in some abstract sense. They were fighting their own nervous system at the same moment they were fighting the enemy. One of the most persistent myths about medieval warfare is that it was slow, clumsy, and simple. Two groups of armored men hacking at each other until one side ran out of people. This idea survives largely because of how armor looks to modern eyes. Heavy, restrictive, medieval plate encasing a man who must surely have moved like a rusted machine. The reality is almost the opposite. A full suit of Gothic plate armor from the 15th century weighed between 15 and 25 kilograms, roughly the same as a modern infantryman's combat kit. Unlike a backpack or vest, however, plate armor distributed that weight across the entire body. A trained knight in full armor could run, roll, mount a horse unassisted, and perform complex footwork. There are training manuals, actual surviving fight books from masters like Hans Talhofer and Fiore de Liberi, that show armored men executing joint locks, throws, ground grappling, and precise blade thrusts aimed at the gaps between plates. Medieval combat, at its highest level, looked less like two men flailing swords and more like a violent, lethal form of wrestling. The sword itself is worth pausing on. People imagine the medieval sword as a blunt instrument, something closer to a club with an edge. But the finest medieval swords were engineering achievements. A well-made longsword of the high medieval period was extraordinarily nimble. Some weighed little more than 1.5 kilograms, and was designed to cut, thrust, and manipulate with precision. The technique of half-swording, where a fighter grips the blade with a gauntlet hand to make the weapon shorter and more controllable, looks insane to modern eyes. To a medieval man-at-arms, it was simply good tactics. Against plate armor, you didn't try to cut. You tried to find the gaps, the armpits, the back of the knee, the visor slit. You turned your sword around and used the pommel as a hammer. You drew a miséricorde, a narrow dagger designed specifically to slide through the breathing holes of a fallen man's helmet, and you used it for exactly what its French name implies. Mercy, though not the kind you'd want. The men who fought these battles were, for the most part, not romantic heroes. The bulk of any medieval army was composed of infantry, Peasants, servants, desperate men press-ganged into service or lured by the promise of pay and plunder. Their weapons were often whatever could be made cheaply and in large numbers: spears, bills, glaives, axes. And their training was minimal to non-existent. This created a profound and rarely discussed imbalance within medieval armies. The knights and men-at-arms at the top of the hierarchy were often superbly trained specialists who had spent years developing lethal skills. The infantry around them might have held a weapon for the first time a week before the battle. What held these men in place wasn't primarily loyalty or courage or even discipline in the modern military sense. It was something more primal, the physical press of other bodies. In a shield wall or a pike formation, men were packed so tightly they could barely lift their sword arms. The men in front couldn't retreat because the men behind them wouldn't let them. In this way, an army solved the problem of individual cowardice through collective physics. You stayed because you literally could not leave without forcing your way through the men at your back, and those men would likely kill you for it. Desertion was, in fact, one of the defining strategic problems of the medieval period. Armies were not standing forces in the modern sense. They were assembled, often from feudal obligation, with men who had farms to return to, families they worried about, and absolutely no ideological stake in whatever dynastic quarrel had caused the war. After a long march, after the promised pay failed to materialize, after the food ran out, men simply went home. Some battles were decided not by combat, but by the calculation that the other side's army would disintegrate before the season ended. And then there was disease. This fact is so dominant in the historical record that it's almost embarrassing how rarely it appears in popular narratives about medieval warfare. In almost every major military campaign of the medieval period, disease killed more soldiers than the enemy did, by a ratio that is sometimes staggering. During the siege of a fortified town or castle, armies assembled outside the walls in conditions of extreme filth and overcrowding. Dysentery, typhus, and intestinal infections ripped through encampments with a thoroughness that no opposing army could match. The besiegers often suffered worse than the besieged. Sieges themselves are a subject most people gloss over, defaulting to the image of a giant catapult flinging rocks at a wall. The mechanics of medieval siege warfare were in fact horrifyingly sophisticated and horrifyingly intimate. When conventional assault and starvation failed, engineers turned to sappers. Men who dug tunnels beneath castle walls, propped the tunnel up with wooden supports, packed the chamber with combustible materials, and then lit it. When the supports burned away, the tunnel collapsed, and so did the section of wall above it. This technique, called mining, required extraordinary courage from the men doing the digging, who worked underground, in darkness, knowing that the enemy above might countermine directly toward them. Men died in the earth, beneath the earth, without ever seeing the sky. When walls fell, the fighting that followed was some of the most psychologically devastating of the medieval period. Combat inside a breach or a narrow gate was stripped of all formation, all tactics, all sense of collective purpose. It became individual, personal, and close. Close enough to see the face you were killing. Close enough to hear what someone says as they die. Men who survived these engagements, documented in the records of chroniclers and occasionally in the rarer accounts of survivors themselves, often described a dissociative quality to the experience, a sense of watching themselves from somewhere slightly outside their bodies. What we would now recognize as acute stress response. What they simply called afterward. The weapons of siege warfare extended well beyond stones. Catapults and trebuchets flung dead horses over walls, not as macabre theater, but as deliberate biological strategy. A rotting animal carcass inside a fortification created disease, panic, and the psychological weight of watching your own water supply become poisoned. There are documented cases of plague victims being catapulted into cities. Whether this constitutes the first recorded use of biological warfare is a debate among historians, but the intention is clear. Medieval commanders understood that terror and disease were weapons, and they used them without hesitation. The treatment of the wounded is another chapter that popular history tends to close quickly. Field medicine in the medieval period was not simply a man with herbs and prayer, though herbs and prayer were certainly present. There were military surgeons, barber surgeons, and trained wound tenders attached to larger armies. Some of their techniques were remarkably effective: cauterization, wound irrigation, removal of foreign bodies from injuries. These were understood and practiced. The removal of arrowheads was a specific subspecialty, complicated by the fact that medieval arrows were often designed to resist extraction. The broadhead arrows used in battle were sometimes forged with barbs specifically to maximize tissue damage on the way in. Removing one meant either pushing it through the other side, which was sometimes done, or widening the wound channel in a way that caused its own damage. Surgeons used a tool called a spoon of Diacles, a curved instrument designed to hook beneath a barbed point and allow extraction. The procedure, performed without effective anesthesia, in the noise and motion of a battlefield, with unsterilized instruments, is something to contemplate in the quiet of your own comfortable present. The psychological aftermath of battle is perhaps the most suppressed chapter of all. Medieval culture had almost no framework for what we now call post-traumatic stress. There was no language for it, no diagnosis, no sanctioned form of treatment. What there was, in many cases, was religion. Men who had witnessed or participated in mass killing went on pilgrimage, endowed churches, paid for masses to be said for the souls of those they had killed. These were not merely acts of piety. They were, in many cases, the only mechanism available for processing experiences that language could not contain. The Knights Hospitaller, the military order most associated with battlefield medicine, operated hospitals that treated what we might today recognize as psychological collapse alongside physical injury. Their records describe men who simply stopped speaking after battle, who refused to eat, who had to be physically restrained from walking back toward the field. The medieval world lacked the vocabulary for trauma, but it recognized the condition. It just didn't know what to do with it. What medieval commanders did understand was the power of the will to fight, and how quickly it could break. The battle cry, the war banner, the music of drums and pipes before engagement, none of this was decoration. It was psychological infrastructure. You screamed because screaming raised your own adrenaline and suppressed the adrenaline of the person in front of you. Experiments in sports psychology have confirmed what medieval warriors intuited. Making noise during physical exertion actually increases performance. The roar before the charge was not bravado. It was a tool. Banners served a similar function. In the chaos of battle, where smoke, blood, and the press of bodies destroyed all sense of orientation, a banner was the only fixed point. Following it was not symbolic. It was survival. If your banner fell, the psychological effect on your own men was immediate and potentially catastrophic. Some of the most decisive moments in medieval battles were the deliberate targeting of the enemy's standard-bearer, not because it was honorable, but because killing him could cause 5,000 men to suddenly believe they were losing even if they weren't. The archers of the medieval period deserve a moment entirely their own. The English longbowmen at Crecy and Agincourt have become legends, but the physical reality of their practice is something rarely examined. Training with a war bow, a weapon requiring a draw weight of 150 to 180 pounds, began in childhood and continued daily throughout a man's life. The skeletal remains of English archers from this period show dramatic asymmetrical development: overdeveloped left arms, curved spines, deformed shoulder joints. Their bodies were permanently altered by their weapon. Archery was not a skill they had. It was a condition they lived inside. And the arrows they fired were not simply flying projectiles. A cloth-yard arrow, fired from a heavy war bow at close range, could penetrate armor that modern testing has shown would stop a crossbow bolt. The sound of 10,000 arrows in flight, which eyewitnesses at Agincourt described as a noise like a rushing wind, was followed almost immediately by a sound that no reconstruction, no documentary, no film has ever accurately captured. The sound of that many men, in that much pain, all at once. There's a detail from the aftermath of Agincourt, in 1415, that I want you to sit with. After the battle, Henry V ordered the execution of a large number of French prisoners. Thousands of men who had already surrendered, were unarmed, and were technically under the protection of the laws of chivalry. His reason was tactical. He feared a French counterattack and couldn't afford to guard them. His knights initially refused. Not out of mercy alone. The prisoners represented enormous ransom value, and killing them meant destroying a financial asset. Henry threatened to hang any knight who didn't comply. The men were killed. The episode is documented. It is not disputed. It sits in complete silence at the center of one of England's most celebrated military victories. This is what medieval warfare actually was. Not the pageant, not the tournament, not the knightly code floating above the mud in clean philosophical certainty. It was calculation. It was economics. It was the decision to kill unarmed men because the math demanded it, made by a king who history would later call great. The men who fought in these wars were not monsters. That's the uncomfortable part. They were operating within systems of obligation, economics, and violence that were entirely normalized by their world. A mercenary captain who burned a village to pressure a lord into paying his troops was not exceptional. He was doing his job. The peasants who died of disease in the wake of an army that had eaten everything in a 50-mile radius were not tragic exceptions to the story. They were the story. Medieval warfare was not the backdrop to history. It was the engine of it. The borders of nations, the distribution of wealth, the language spoken in a region, the religion practiced in a town. Almost all of it was decided, at some point, by men standing in a field trying not to die, making choices no one was going to write down honestly for several hundred years. What we remember is the armor, the castles, the swords catching the light. What we forget is the weight of it, the smell of it, the sound of it, the way a man looks at his own hands after. History doesn't sanitize the past to protect the dead. It sanitizes the past to protect us, the living, from having to truly reckon with what human beings are capable of when given a banner, a cause, and permission. The field is quiet now. The smoke has cleared. Whatever was decided here today will become, in a few hundred years, a footnote, a date, a paragraph. But somewhere beneath a car park in Leicester, beneath a motorway in France, beneath a farmer's field in Hungary or Poland or Syria, the bones are still there. They remember.